So welcome everyone. This session's paper will be presented by Vella. Sarah is a PhD candidate at Deakin University and is a member of the university's Rural Communication Research Cluster. Her talk is titled "The Role of Early Australian News Media in Shaping the Cultural Imaginary of the Brumby." Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Hi everyone. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so we'll just get started. So as Alison said, my talk is on our paper that is called "The Role of Early Australian News in Media in Shaping the Cultural Imaginary of the Brumby." This paper explores the deep historical roots of opposing representations of brumbies in Australian news media. The debate that surrounds brumbies and their management in Australia is live and ongoing. It is an environmental issue that needs solving, but it's also a highly polarised debate. For example, in April this year, ABC Online printed the article "Feral Horse Plan Advocates Shooting Brumbies to Save Victoria's Vulnerable Alpine Region." In June, The Guardian printed "Alpine Brumbies, Destructive Feral Hoofed Beasts or a Heritage Breed to Protect." And the Sydney Morning Herald, "Barilaro's Brumby Bill has been a catastrophe for the high country." In September, a non-fiction book by Anthony Sharwood called "Brumby Wars" was released. All of these examples explore the tensions between those who view the wild horses of the high country as a cultural icon and those who see them as destructive pests. It is widely acknowledged that controversial debates often play out through news media and that media can become actors in such debates. There is little research that explores the role of news media in shaping public understanding of the Brumby or the early mediated origins of this highly contentious issue. This paper explores representations of the Brumby in early Australian newspapers between 1870 and 1921. Some research credits the iconic status of the Brumby to A.B. Patterson's poem, in particular, "The Man from Snowy River" from 1890 and "Brumby's Run" from 1894. This has arguably signified the roots of the cultural iconic status that is afforded to the wild horses today. The issue of the management of Australia's wild horses has been newsworthy since the 1840s. We began this paper with the curiosity as to where and when the term Brumby was first applied to wild horses in Australian news media. And to better understand the role of media in constructing polarised representations, it is crucial to trace the history of such contentious issues. Our research questions are: how was the Brumby represented in Australian news coverage between 1870 and 1921? And how did Australian news coverage help shape the cultural imaginary of the Brumby? Horses first arrived in Australia with European settlers on the First Fleet in 1788, with just 7 surviving the journey. By 1800, just 200 had made it to Australia. It is often said that only the toughest horses could survive the grueling sea journey. The existence of wild horses in Australia has been documented as far back as 1804. By the 1840s, every mainland Australian state had a population of wild horses, and by the 1850s, numbers of wild horses reached an estimated 160,000. Today, numbers are estimated anywhere between 400,000 and 1 million, making it the largest population of wild horses in the world. There are an estimated 25,000 wild horses in the Alpine regions of New South Wales and Victoria. While the largest populations are concentrated in Queensland and Northern Territory, it is in the Snowy Mountain regions where their heritage status is most recognised. Made evident by the ongoing and passionate debate surrounding the management of brumbies in Australia is the significant power they hold for conjuring romance and myth, particularly in the Snowy Mountain region. Over the years, this myth has been perpetuated by popular culture, such as the Man from Snowy River movies and books, as well as the Silver Brumby movies and books. Over time, these literary works have rendered the earlier antagonistic views of farmers toward wild horses forgotten. Constructing the Brumby as heritage positions them as part of the narrative of Australian identity, and by positioning them this way as Australia's heritage horses, supporters can strategically complicate the value system that excludes the Brumby from nature by entering it into culture. The Brumby's contribution to a cultural imaginary forms the theoretical lens for this paper. Discussion of imaginaries and their relationships to news media tends to draw on Anderson's imagined communities, with some reference to Taylor's broader construction of social imaginaries. Given the synergies in existing literature between the Brumby as a cultural icon and the shaping of a cultural imaginary, we create an early distinction here to focus on the cultural. Ward, for example, takes issue with the idea of a strictly social imaginary because he contends that even the idea of the social is situated within and emerges from the cultural. The cultural imaginary is the magma of social meanings. It has also been identified by some scholars that Taylor and Anderson's frameworks don't necessarily provide scope to address issues of power. We take further inspiration from scholars who discuss contested imaginaries. Jessup, for example, contends that imaginaries do not just construct communities or intellectual frameworks, as Taylor assumed, but entail strategic struggle to assemble coalitions, mobilize state projects, and stabilize conjoined economical and ideational systems. In positioning the way media creates reality, we draw on the construct of symbolic power. Arising out of theorization of Bourdieu, Thompson defines symbolic power as the capacity to intervene in the course of events and influence the actions of others by means of the production and transmission of symbolic forms. For Bourdieu, it is language above all that creates the world. The power of language determines the social structures through which meaning is created and also contested. Journalism has long been revered for its role in holding the powerful to account and serving as a neutral conduit for people to deliberate about public affairs. Concepts of objectivity, accuracy, and truth, and the Habermasian idea of a public sphere are at the core of a shared normative understanding of professional journalism. In adopting a symbolic power lens to consider the role of media in constructing reality, we must also pay attention to the array of voices and the array of content in news media that is given a platform to shape the way we see reality. That is, content beyond what is produced by journalists. Much like the contested imaginary that we use to situate the brumby debate, there is also contested ideas of what legitimate news content is and who produces it. The elite or quality press use its prime journalistic purpose as being democracy's watchdog. It therefore emphasizes hard news on topics such as domestic and foreign policy, politics, the economy, and national security. Broader content within a newspaper, from advertising to news stories, leisure, and sport, all play a role in reinforcing news media's symbolic power. Hess and Gush highlight social dimensions of news, connections to social honor, and the making of heroes and villains, virtue, vice, and myth as important components of journalism, as well as the banal, such as stories about the weather, sport, social events, and activities. In early Australia, newspapers were not only the main source of periodical fiction, but the main source of fiction in general. As Bode explains, literary historians have been long aware of the importance of newspapers to the history of reading and publishing in Australia and have understood the bush tradition to have arisen in the 1890s, particularly in the pages of the Bulletin magazine, during a time when stories and poetry were a popular addition to newspapers. It is this affinity with literary prose in the early Australian newspapers that arguably has the strongest link to establishing a cultural imaginary of the brumby. Boyle notes that sport reporting has been considered a form of soft journalism practice that is considered distinctive from the rigour and objectivity of hard news, where narratives and myths of the sporting hero, as well as notions of masculinity, are equally prevalent. We collected a media corpus of 191 articles from Australian news media between 1870 and 1921 through the online database Trove, using the search terms Brum, Asterix, and Wild. We used all newspapers located in the database, and we excluded Tasmania as there weren't any brumbies in Tasmania, and there was also the surname brumby was very prevalent in Tasmania, so it skewed the results a bit. We conducted a qualitative content analysis, and the content was open coded to identify key themes. And we looked at all content within the newspapers, from columns, articles, advertising, to poetry and literary fiction. Through our search, we found that the first reference to brumby in an Australian newspaper was on Tuesday, October the 10th in 1871 in the Maitland Mercury in the Walgett news column. Is an article about appraising grazing land that suggests that if land is only fit for a mob of brumbies, it is inferior and worth less money. The second reference to brumbies in the Brisbane Courier on Saturday, March 13, 1875, in a contributed article called Buzzers from Borderland. Ahem, sir, pardon me, have you ever shot a brumby? The question was civil, the answer hot. What the warm place do you call a brumby? I told him a brumby merely meant a wild horse and mildly suggested that his extraordinary talents as a marksman could not be put to better use during his brief sojourn into the outlandish country around him. The themes that emerged during this period include brumbies as a nuisance, for example, enticing horses from stations and competing for pasture with livestock. Brumby culling for money, they would sell the skins as well as their mane and tail hair. The celebrated sport of brumby shooting. The brumby run, which is a method of catching brumbies where riders would run the brumbies on horseback, either into a trap or until they were tired enough for them to rope from their horses. Defense for horse stealing, which happens to be the inspiration for Patterson's poem Brumby's Run, which the author prefaced with, "Brumby is the Aboriginal word for wild horse." At a recent trial, a New South Wales Supreme Court judge hearing of brumby horses asked, "Who is Brumby and where is his run?" Brumby's Run was not included in our analysis as it was first published in a periodical called The Bulletin and not a newspaper. And Brumbies and War, stories of the wild horses being captured and sent to India as remounts to be used in the Boer War and World War I. By positioning newspaper content in a cultural context, we can start to distinguish brumby fact, fiction, narrative, and myth, and can see that general news coverage conveys a tacit assumption of brumbies and pests, and articles often feature numbers of brumbies killed, earnings, and profit. In keeping with the style of news reporting during the late 1800s, early 1900s, graphic descriptions of brumby slaughter were common. For example, in the Durham and Gloucester Advertiser in 1897, a crush, that is long lines of parallel fences, just wide enough for one horse to pass at a time, was erected. They were driven into this long lane, and at the end, which stood an expert armed with a keen knife. As each animal passed, its jugular vein was severed, and the bleeding creature tore madly away into its native scrub, only to stagger and die from loss of blood within half a mile of the trap. This device, though barbarous, did away with the difficulty of removing carcasses and became the universal method of destruction. And in the Gosford Times and Wyong District Advocate in 1919, I was doing good work with my Snyder, boring holes in brumbies as big as bore drains. Stories about brumbies and their unwanted impacts on agricultural production often generated negative representations, including nuisance, mongrel, unappreciated, much despised, ill-bred, pest, black devils. On the following slides, I'll explain how the romance, myth, and glorification of the brumby developed during this period, through the emergence of literary fiction and poetry, the glorification of brumby running as a sport, and the brumby hunt, a ritualistic, regular social event showcasing the best horsemen of the region. It is through literary fiction that the romance and myth of the brumby is first introduced. The earliest piece of literary fiction that featured the term brumby appears to be in the Queensland Figaro and Punch on Saturday, January 16, 1886, 4 years before Patterson's Man from Snowy River. It's called The Pioneers by Peter Buncombe. Running the clearskin, the brumby, the Warrigal Yarraman, wild horse of Australia, takes preeminence above all the glories of the chase in other lands. Another piece of literary fiction to mention the brumby was published in an illustrated Sydney News in December 1889, in a story called Luck from the Wilderness, an Australian Christmas story. Going after brumbies today, boss. Brumbies, a name given to the herds of wild horses to be found in some parts of the colony. Poetry featuring brumbies was also a common occurrence during the time frame of investigation. For example, Warrigal Jack from 1892, Where the Brumbies Come to Water from 1895, The Brumby King from 1911, and A Brumby Hunt from 1921. The shooting and running of brumbies was often described as an exciting sport, and those involved as tough, heroic, or gallant. In the Queensland Figaro and Punch in 1887, then again, there is the young colonial. He's just completed a brilliant university career at Cambridge or Oxford, and he thinks of the wild chase of the brumby, wild horse, when a boy, and compares such sport to his cricket and boating pastimes of university days. In the World's News in 1919, yarding wild horses is one of the most exciting of the bush sports of Australia. Shouts arise, whips crack, and the astonished brumbies fly for safety. Over and through all obstacles they go, followed by some of the hardest and gamest riders in the world, many of whom, nevertheless, often come to grief before the wild spin is over. In the Smiths Weekly in 1920, There were good riders in town as well as outside, and once in a while, one of these managed to bring home a prize. He might have bought a reliable town hack for less than he spent in time, not to mention the risk of breaking his neck in the capture of the wild horse. But there was a distinction in riding a genuine brumby. In the Sydney Stock and Station Journal in 1920, old hands with glistening eyes tell of those bygone times, of the glorious rides, of the magnificent horsemanship of prominent brumby hunters, and the wonderful staying powers of the horses they bestrode. We have found, while we have traced the establishment of the cultural imaginary around the brumby, we also found evidence of the beginning of a contested imaginary around the wild horse, and when it was first publicly discussed. In March 1888, the column Wild Horses in the Sportsman illustrates that the romance and the myth of the brumby was developing in the cultural imaginary and provides evidence of the frustration among some parties around the emerging cultural imaginary at that time. The wild horse is always an attractive theme. There is plenty of room for the play of the imagination, and the average pencil shover, not feeling the crushing handicap of facts, rolls off page after page in the most airy manner. We have very few horsemen's description of these animals, and as far as I can learn, and the pictures given us are either overly artistic or not reliable. The brumbies are described by Anthony Trollope as perfect marvels of ugliness, and elsewhere we are told that they are small, hardy, and remarkable for the excellence of their feet, but seldom worth the trouble of capture and training. Its most striking features are a most ugly head, with coarse Roman nose and convex forehead, short muzzle, little cranium head, badly set on no shoulder, ugly quarters, round short hocks. If the travellers who have furnished us with word and pencil pictures of the wild equine had thoroughly known the horse, his anatomy, habits, and peculiarities of action, they would have restrained flights of imagination, and the anxious searcher for knowledge would turn to them with a higher degree of confidence than he does today. We have writers in this country who pretend to have critical knowledge of the equine form, who are over fond of quoting descriptions from old authors of wild horses in the effort to establish certain propositions. As so many of these descriptions are romantic in character, logic based upon them is rather shaky. By considering the historic origins of the brumby in Australian newspapers, we have been able to map the beginnings of a cultural imaginary of the brumby in Australia, starting with the very use of the term brumby in news media discourse. We found that it was largely through literary fiction and poetry, as well as the reporting on the sport of capturing and hunting brumbies, that helped shape this imaginary. We have identified a place where a dichotomy forms over an issue that becomes a long-standing environmental conflict, and have shown that issues can be really persistent over time. We found evidence of polarizing representations surrounding the brumby in early Australian newspapers and public discourse, with a particular focus on the cultural imaginary. This cultural imaginary is a toxic attitude in the current debate, so even people who want to see the brumbies culled are still able to recognise their cultural status. The long-standing issue and debate is a great illustration of the media's ability to construct and maintain symbolic power, and the doxa of the brumby as a national icon. When investigating news media and its ability to shape reality through the lens of symbolic power, we must broaden our horizons to the array of media content beyond hard news and journalism, to consider how an imaginary is symbolically constructed and how these platforms help to shape the representations, such as we have seen in the results of this paper. This paper and its findings will inform the research that I am undertaking for my PhD, which is investigating media representations of the brumby debate in contemporary news coverage and the role that news media plays in shaping these representations. Thank you.
Nice one. Thank you, Sarah. It was really interesting. I love the pictures. It just makes you want to go to the high country, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, it does.
I'll open it up to questions. Please just turn your microphone on if you'd like to ask a question. That would be preferable, but if you'd like to just type it into a chat, then that's fine as well. I can read it out if you'd prefer. So just feel free to yell out or put your little yellow emoji hand up if you'd like to ask a question. Oh, Sarah, I have heaps, but I'll open it up to others first.
Okay, I'll go. Thanks for that, Sarah. That was very, very interesting. Particularly the kind of the two sides of the picture going right back to the 19th century. That was, that was really interesting. I'm just a query, if you like, on I think your decision to exclude the bulletin from your study. And if you're looking at daily newspapers, I get that it's not a daily newspaper, it's a kind of weekly. But two questions, if you like. One, it is a pretty prominent part of the kind of overall news media for a long time. And also, without having read a lot in the bulletin about brumbies, but I'm just wondering how, first question, and then how significant they are in terms of the way they represented the whole brumby debate. And so if they were, I'm wondering whether you would sort of make an exception or kind of say you're including them for these reasons or whatever, but I don't know. So I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we didn't look at anything that didn't come up in the Trove search as specifically as a newspaper. So we excluded periodicals and things like that, which is why the bulletin was excluded. But yeah, I'm sure if we looked into it and that it did look like that there was lots of coverage in the bulletin, it could definitely be something that we included. Yep, definitely. It's just as for this paper specifically.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
it was just.
But, which was the poem you quoted early on? Was that published in the bulletin? One of the one, is it? Or I'm going to get my papers mixed up.
Brumbies Run. It's Patterson's poem Brumbies Run, which is in a lot of discourse today is mentioned as creating that romance and the myth of the brumby. But so that's why we thought it was important to mention it, because it is something that's sort of credited with that status of the horse today. But as it has been published in newspapers, but as it was first published in the bulletin, we didn't include it.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. It might be interesting to see around that, kind of before and after, whether that sparked discussion within their pages or whatever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks,
Matthew. Any other questions? Well, I have some. I'll start with one anyway. Is it safe to say that the early papers that you've been looking through, although they've been developing sort of not just the hard news, they were reporting brumbies in a hard news way where they were pests and there was, let's shoot them and all this sort of stuff, fairly violent sort of record, that the more poetic and story and literary type journalism that was going on around them, the brumby was still sort of seen in that same light mostly as a pest and something to be shot and hunted and as a thing of sport?
Yes. Often it was the sport that's the sort of the overriding theme with a lot of even the early works. You could see just in the titles of those poems there that, 2 out of those 4 were on the sport or the hunt or killing them. But there was also sort of just that romantic notion that comes through. So the relaying their beauty and as that piece was saying toward the end, that not many people sort of know what they're talking about when they're talking about horses. They're kind of ugly and they they're not pretty, so why do people keep telling us that they are? So that did happen a little bit, but you're right, it's still often sort of overridden by the sport or the hunting or them needing to be removed. Yeah,
I guess I'm sort of wondering that you're right, like you said there started to be a contested sort of idea of, well, how are we actually looking at them? Where are we getting our sources from? If we're not hearing it from the stockman, where are we getting, how do we know what these things look like? But it seems like we've come a very long way now to have such a conflicted media debate about them now, that there's still that they're pests and destructive, but now there's also the the cultural and the love of them. We need to keep them, not just to shoot them, but we need to keep them.
But because they add to the heritage status of the country. So they're seen as a national icon that represents colonial history and war history and just a time before cars. because people have trouble distinguishing horses and brumbies as well. They are the same. They're technically, genetically, they're the same, but they have a different history. And also, I think because a lot of the current debate is focused on the horses in the Kosciuszko Park and the Alpine regions of Victoria, and there's a lot of that drawback to that early romanticism through Patterson's poems. So
definitely. Yeah. We have a question in the chat from Amanda. Thanks, Amanda. It's talking about rabbits, because unless you wanted to have a read there, or Amanda, did you want to voice a question to Sarah, or I'm happy to read it out if you'd like. I'll read it out. Mike is dead, sorry. Okay, that's fine. So Amanda says that in her research, she often comes across rabbits as a main introduced pest. She wonders if your research, Sarah, finds similar themes of acclimatization that have been introduced to discussions of environmental history around rabbits and weasels and so on, or biological control methods that were experimented with for pests. So have you come across anything like that?
Not in this early research from the early newspapers. Sometimes they will talk about wild cattle as well. More rarely wild camels and donkeys. But you know, obviously the obvious ones, foxes and cats and things like that. But only that there's no. Sometimes sort of the brumby was sort of bundled in with those other feral pest species, and we're talking about how, you know, it's important to control them as a general you know, group of pest animals, and not have I haven't seen anything about biological control of brumbies except in the more modern literature. There is talk of sterilizing them and that kind of stuff, but that's not in the historical literature, no. And I don't see anything about rabbits when I'm looking up horses. Sometimes I see deer and pigs, not rabbits.
I've been wondering about, I know that you're, you know, sort of been focused on Australian history and looking at how the beginnings of the myth of the brumby. It's going to be really interesting to hear and see if that sort of thing was happening overseas as well. Like, was there other countries where wild horses were, this myth of a wild horse was being developing? I mean, you said we have the most.
Yeah, we do have the most. It happens in America a bit with the Mustang, and their connections to Native Americans. But you do see a little bit so when I'm looking up the literature around brumbies or wild horses, you do see a little bit of stuff around the Mustang. And that's probably the most. New Zealand has a small population of wild horses. I'm not quite sure if they have a special name for them over there. But yeah, you don't necessarily see the amount of coverage that we get, but I haven't specifically looked overseas, no.
It's something for the future for the PhD. It's going to be a big, lovely project. I'm just looking at the time now. We've hit our 30-minute mark.
Sure. Whalers aren't the same as brumbies. No. That's a quick
I was going to say Mark's questions are good. No, what's a whaler then?
In the sort of early 1900s, they call it a breed, but it's basically just a type of horse that they chose to send to the war. They were called New South Wales after. They're called whalers after New South Wales, and they would. It's more of a type than a breed. They do have a breed society these days, but they're not. It's not specifically a breed. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks for clearing that up.
That's right.
And thank you very much for your presentation. It was really insightful, really interesting. Well done.
Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for that. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.